It's a strange thing, standing at the edge of your own life and realizing you never actually saw the whole shape of it until someone else tried to burn it down. Not the good years or the hard years, not the mortgage payments or the funerals, but one single evening where a man you trusted more than your own reflection stood up in front of everyone you love and lit a match. My name is Walter, and for 68 years I thought the ground under my feet was the one thing in this world I never had to question. I was wrong. I just didn't know it yet. I'm not a complicated man. Never have been. I spent 41 years running a hardware store on the corner of Route 9 and Miller Street in a town called Belhaven, Ohio, small enough that everybody's business was everybody's business, and big enough that you could still disappear into it if you needed to. I had thick forearms from decades of hauling lumber, a permanent squint from staring into sunlight through a dusty storefront window, and a laugh that my late father used to say sounded like a truck backing up. My grandkids thought that was the funniest thing in the world. I wasn't a rich man. I wasn't a famous man, but I built something with my hands, and more than that, I built a family, plank by plank, nail by nail, the same way I'd built half the porches in that town. My daughter Rachel had organized the whole party. She'd inherited her mother's gift for making a room feel warm just by walking into it, and she'd spent 3 weeks planning every detail that she did. That's down to the little card at each table with a photo of me from decades back, grinning like an idiot beside my first delivery truck. We were at the Elks Lodge on the edge of town, the same building where I'd had my wedding reception, the same building where we'd held 2 funerals I'd rather not think about. String lights were draped along the ceiling beams. Someone had made a banner that said Happy 68th Walter in gold cursive letters, a little crooked on one end because my grandson Eli had insisted on hanging it himself. My wife, Dorothy, sat beside me in a soft blue dress, the same shade she liked to remind me as the one she'd worn the night I proposed to her on the pier in 1979. Her hands had gone thin with age, the knuckles a little swollen now, but I still remembered exactly what those hands felt like the first time I held them. She kept reaching over and squeezing my arm every few minutes, like she needed to remind herself I was really there, really turning 68, really still breathing after everything this family had survived together. Across from us sat my 2 children and their families. My daughter Rachel, 41 now, a nurse practitioner who'd spent her whole adult life patching up other people's emergencies and somehow still had room left over to organize a birthday party down to the napkin folds. Beside her sat her husband Tom, a good, quiet man who'd learned a long time ago that the best way to survive a family gathering was to nod, smile, and refill drinks. And then there was my son, 5, Nathaniel, Nate, to everyone who loved him. He was 39 years old, built like me in my prime, broad through the shoulders with my father's stubborn jaw. He worked as a paramedic, which had terrified Dorothy for the better part of 15 years, and he had our family's temper, the kind that flared hot and fast and burned out just as quick. He'd driven 4 hours that afternoon from Columbus just to be there, and when he'd walked through the door and wrapped his arms around me, I'd felt something in my chest loosen that I hadn't even realized was tight. Nate had always been the one I worried about loving too much. Not because I loved him more than Rachel, I didn't, not for one single second of his life, but because there had always been a strange, quiet distance in him that I never quite understood. He'd call me Dad with total ease, but there were moments, brief flickers, where I'd catch him studying my face like he was trying to solve some kind of equation. I used to think it was just his nature. Some kids are huggers. Some kids keep a little bit of themselves locked away, even from the people who love them most. I told myself that's all it was. At the head of our table, to my immediate right, sat Gerald. Gerald Whitfield had been my best friend since we were 9 years old, since the summer he moved into the house 2 doors down from mine and caught a garter snake with his bare hands just to impress me. We'd gone through everything together: Little League, my first heartbreak, his 2 divorces, my father's funeral, the birth of every single one of my children. He was the best man at my wedding. He was Nate's godfather. When my hardware store nearly went under in 2009, Gerald was the one who co-signed the loan that saved it, no hesitation, no questions asked. I would have taken a bullet for that man. I genuinely believed, for over 5 decades, that he would have taken one for me. He looked good that night, better than a man in his late 60s had any right to look, a full head of silver hair combed back the way he always wore it, a tan from one too many golf trips to Florida, a crisp navy blazer that probably cost more than my first car. Gerald had done well for himself, real estate mostly, And he never let anybody forget it, though he did it with enough charm that people mostly forgave him. He had that gift. People forgave Gerald things they would never forgive anyone else. The dinner rolled on the way these things do, plates of pot roast and green beans, my grandkids sneaking extra rolls off the breadbasket, somebody's phone going off with a ringtone from a song I didn't recognize. I felt full in every sense of the word. Full stomach, full heart, full house. I remember thinking, somewhere between the second slice of cake and the third toast, that I was the luckiest man in Belhaven, Ohio. Maybe the luckiest man anywhere. I was wrong about that too. It happened right as the room was starting to wind down, right when Rachel stood up to make her toast, the sentimental one she'd clearly rehearsed, the one where her voice cracked on the second sentence and she had to stop and dab at her eyes with a paper napkin. She'd just gotten to the part where she said, "Dad, you have always been the steadiest man I've ever known," when the sound of a fork tapping sharply against a wine glass cut clean through the room. Everyone turned. It was Gerald. He was on his feet, glass raised, and there was a look on his face I want to say I'd never seen before, but that would be a lie. I had seen it, just once, decades earlier, at a poker table when he was about to bluff a man out of $400 he didn't have. It was the look of a man who had been sitting on something for a very long time and had finally decided the moment had come to let it out into the world, consequences be damned. "Sorry, Rachel. Sorry. I know this is your moment," Gerald said, his voice smooth, unhurried, the voice of a man who'd rehearsed every word in a mirror. "But there's something that needs to be said tonight, something that's needed saying for 39 years. My stomach dropped straight through the floor. The room had gone silent in that particular way a room goes silent right before something terrible happens, the kind of silence where you can hear the ice settling in the water glasses. Dorothy's hand found my arm and gripped it so hard I felt her nails through my sleeve. "Walter," Gerald said, and he turned to look directly at me, and for the first time in 59 years of friendship, I did not recognize the expression on his face. "You have been my brother since we were 9 years old, and I have loved this family like it was my own." He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting every eye in that room fix on him. "But I can't sit here another year and let a lie keep breathing. Not tonight, not on your birthday. This family deserves the truth." He turned to my son, Nate. His voice thickened with something that might have passed for regret if I hadn't known him 59 years. "I've called myself your godfather your whole life, but that's not what I am to you. I'm your father, your real father. Walter isn't your biological dad, son. I am." The words landed in that room like a physical blow, and I watched them ripple outward across every face I loved. Nate's jaw went slack. Rachel's hand flew to her mouth. Dorothy made a sound I had never heard her make in 45 years of marriage. Something between a gasp and a sob, strangled halfway out of her throat. I did not move. "I want you to understand something about me, whoever you are listening to this story tonight, whatever chair you're sitting in, whatever kitchen table or car seat or porch swing you've got yourself settled into. I have been angry exactly 4 times in my adult life that I truly lost control. This was not going to be a fifth. Something cold and still settled over me instead. A kind of clarity I can't fully explain even now. It was like watching the whole scene unfold from somewhere just above my own head. Gerald had expected me to explode. I could see it in the way he was watching me, waiting, almost hungry for it, waiting for me to slam my fist on the table, to call him a liar, to give him the show he'd clearly been rehearsing in his head on every one of those golf trips to Florida. He wanted a war. I gave him silence instead, and I watched it unsettle him more than any shouting match ever could have. "Dad." Nate's voice came out small, cracked down the middle, 39 years old and sounding for one terrible second like he was 7 again. "Dad, is he telling the truth?" Every face at that table turned toward me. Rachel had gone white as the tablecloth. Tom had his arm braced around her shoulders like he thought she might actually fall out of her chair. My grandson, Eli, only 12, was staring at his father with a look of confusion so raw it broke something in my chest. I picked up my water glass. My hand did not shake, which surprised me more than anything else that happened that whole night. I took a slow sip, set it back down with a soft, deliberate click against the tablecloth, and I looked at Gerald for a long moment before I finally spoke. "He's lying," I said. My voice came out low, even, steady as a heartbeat. "Don't listen to him, son. Listen to me. Notice what I didn't say. I didn't say, "Of course I'm your father. Don't be ridiculous." I didn't say, "You're crazy, Gerald, and everyone at this table knows it." I said he was lying, and I let those 3 words sit in the air like a held breath, because the truth was more complicated than a denial, and I was not yet ready to hand it over to a room full of people who weren't prepared to hold it. Gerald's mouth curved into something almost like triumph. He reached into the inside pocket of that expensive navy blazer and pulled out a folded manila envelope, worn soft at the corners like it had been carried around for a very long time, waiting for exactly this moment. He set it down in front of Nate with a soft, deliberate thud. "It's all there," Gerald said, and his voice had dropped into something quieter, something that almost sounded gentle, which made it worse. "Paternity results. The letters your mother wrote me back in '86. Every piece of it. I've carried this for 39 years. Nate, because I didn't want to break this family apart. But you're a grown man now. You deserve to know where you actually come from." Dorothy made another sound, a strangled half-word, and then she found her voice fully and it came out as a scream that cracked the whole room open. "He's lying. Gerald, how dare you do this in front of my grandchildren, Walter. Tell him he's lying." I did not look at her. I kept my eyes locked on Gerald, and something in that stillness must have frightened him a little, because his confident smile flickered, just for a second, like a bulb about to blow. "Sit down, Gerald," I said. He laughed, but it came out thinner than he wanted it to. "For what, Walter? You'll finally lose that temper everybody's been waiting 68 years to see? Show them what you're really like underneath all that steady as a rock nonsense." "No," I said. "I just want you to sit down and be quiet. You've said your piece. Now it's my turn." He didn't sit, but he stopped talking, which was close enough. I turned to my son. Nate was still holding that envelope like it was something radioactive, unopened, his hands trembling in a way I hadn't seen since he was a boy afraid of thunderstorms. "Nate," I said, softer now, "look at me, not at the paper, at me." "Ah." He looked up. Those were my late mother's hazel eyes staring back at me, the ones he'd had since the day he was born, the ones I used to tell him made him look like a Kowalski even when everyone said he had Gerald's easy grin. He looked at me the way he'd looked at me 1,000 times before waiting up past his bedtime for me to come home from the store, standing at the end of the driveway the day I taught him to ride his bike without training wheels, sitting in a hospital waiting room the night his own daughter was born, gripping my hand so hard I thought he'd break it. "A father," I said, "isn't the man who happens to be involved in how a child gets made. A father is the man who's there for the 39 years after. Purpose. He's the man who sits up all night when you have the croup. He's the man who works a second shift at the lumber yard so you can play travel baseball. He's the man who teaches you to drive stick in an empty parking lot on a Sunday morning and doesn't yell once, not even when you nearly put us through a chain-link fence." I paused, and I let my next words land with everything I had left in me. "I am your father, Nate. That's not a denial. That's not a cover-up. That is the God's honest truth." Pause. It paused. "You knew," Nate said, and his voice broke wide open. "You knew, didn't you? You knew this whole time and you never told me." I didn't answer that directly. I couldn't. End quote. I couldn't. Not yet. That was the one thing I was not ready to hand over to that room. Not until the moment was right, and somewhere deep down I already knew the moment was almost here. "I knew Gerald was lying about one very specific thing," I said instead. "And I knew you were my son the day you were born, screaming your head off in that delivery room, and I've known it every single day since. I made a choice 39 years ago, Nate. I held you in my arms and I chose to be your father, and no piece of paper was ever going to change that." Dorothy was sobbing openly now, both hands pressed over her face. Rachel had gone completely still, watching her brother, her father, the wreckage of the family dinner around her. "Open the envelope," I said quietly. "Look at the date on the test, son. Just the date." His hands shook so badly it took him 3 tries to tear the seal. He pulled the papers free, scanned them fast, his eyes darting line to line, searching, I imagine, for whatever piece of ground he could find to stand on. And then he stopped, went very still, stared at one line near the top of the second page. "It says 1,987, Nate said, his voice barely above a whisper. Gerald's smile finally, fully cracked. That's when I confirmed it. That's when I finally found out for certain. I shook my head slowly. No, Gerald, that's not what that date means, and you know it better than anyone at this table. I turned back to my son. Bye, 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 I, bye. Your mother and I got married in 1985, Nate. We'd been married 2 years by the time that test was run. You weren't even a thought yet when your mother and Gerald. I stopped myself, chose my next words with the same care I used to choose a piece of lumber, testing it first for the grain before I cut. There was a night, before your mother and I got married, when she and Gerald were together. One night. It happened before we were even engaged, before I'd asked her to be my wife. She told me everything before our wedding day, every bit of it, because she didn't want to start our marriage with a secret sitting between us. I looked at Gerald now, and for the first time in 59 years, I let him see exactly what I thought of him. And you knew that, Gerald. You knew there was a chance. And instead of ever telling either of us the truth like a man, you waited. You waited 39 years, and you left those results somewhere you knew Dorothy would find them back before we ever had Nate. You wanted to blow up my marriage before it even started. That's why the date matters. That's why I know exactly what kind of man you really are. Dorothy's head snapped up. That was you, she said, her voice suddenly ice-cold beneath the tears. I found an envelope on our porch a month before the wedding, Gerald. No note, no name. I always wondered who left it. It was you. The whole room had gone graveyard silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. This is insane, Gerald sputtered, and for the first time that whole night the smooth, practiced charm had entirely drained out of his voice. This is you're twisting this, Walter. You're making me out to be some kind of villain. You made yourself into that, I said, and I finally stood up, my legs a little unsteady beneath me but my voice steadier than it had been in years. You've been carrying a grudge for 39 years, because Dorothy chose me. You've been waiting for the exact right moment to try and take my family apart, and you picked my 68th birthday to do it. But all you've managed to do tonight, Gerald, is show every single person in this room exactly who you really are. Dorothy rose to her feet, tears streaking her makeup, her voice trembling but absolutely unwavering. Get out, she said. Get out of this building, Gerald. And don't you ever call this family again. Nate stood next, and he was taller than Gerald by a good 3 inches, and he walked around the table slow and deliberate and stood right in front of the man who'd carried him on his shoulders at county fairs, taught him to bait a hook, called himself Uncle Gerald his whole entire life. You're not my father, Nate said, and his voice had gone hard as the lumber I used to cut for a living. You're a man who slept with my mother one time before she married someone better. That's all you are to me. Not a father, not family, nothing. He picked the envelope back up off the table and pushed it into Gerald's chest hard enough that Gerald actually stumbled back a step. Gerald looked around that room at Dorothy's fury, at Rachel's cold, silent stare, at Nate standing like a wall between him and the rest of us, and something in his face finally collapsed. Whatever triumph he'd walked in with was gone completely, replaced by the look of a man realizing, all at once, that he had just set fire to the one thing in his life that had ever actually mattered. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something else, some final defense, but nothing came out. He turned, and he walked out of the Elks Lodge alone, and the door swung shut behind him with a sound that felt, somehow, final. Nobody moved for a long moment. Then Rachel let out a shaky breath and reached for her brother's hand, and Dorothy sank back into her chair beside me, and my grandson Eli, 12 years old and too young to fully understand what he'd just watched, asked in a small voice whether the party was over. I sank back down into my chair too. All the adrenaline that had kept my spine straight through the whole confrontation drained out of me at once, and I felt every one of my 68 years settle into my bones like a weight I'd been holding off for the length of one very long dinner. I'm sorry, I said, looking at my son. I'm sorry you had to find out this way. I should have told you. A long time ago, if not the truth about Gerald. I should have told you how much you meant to me over and over, so many times that you never had a single reason to doubt it. Nate came and knelt down beside my chair the way he used to when he was a boy asking to stay up late. He took my hand in both of his, and his grip was steady even though his voice wasn't. You did tell me, Dad, he said. You told me every single day. Every ball game you drove me to at 5 in the morning. Every time you sat up with me the night before a big test. Every time you bailed me out of trouble I didn't deserve to get bailed out of. His voice cracked wide open. That paper doesn't mean anything. It never did. Rachel came around the table and wrapped her arms around both of us from behind, her cheek pressed against the back of my neck. Tom put a steady hand on my shoulder. Dorothy took my other hand, and for one long moment the five of us, six counting Eli, who'd wandered over and wedged himself into the middle of it all without anyone asking him to held on to each other in the wreckage of a party that had turned, for a few terrible minutes, into something else entirely. "Walter," Dorothy said quietly, her voice thick with tears. "I should have told you about that letter I found all those years ago. I was so afraid you'd think less of me for that one night, even though it happened before we were ever engaged. I was so afraid of losing you." I squeezed her hand. "You could never lose me," I said. "I chose you a long time ago, Dorothy. I chose this whole family. I've never once regretted a single day of it." I looked around that table at the people I loved most in this world, my wife, my daughter, my son, the family I'd built with my own two hands the same way I'd built half the porches in Bellhaven. And I understood something then that I don't think I'd ever let myself fully understand before. My legacy was never going to be that hardware store on Route 9. It was never going to be the loans I paid off or the roof I kept over our heads. It was going to be this: a boy who wasn't mine by blood, kneeling beside my chair at 68 years old, telling me I'd been his father every single day of his life. That was the only proof that had ever mattered. That was the only inheritance worth leaving behind. We stayed at that lodge another hour, quieter now, gentler, the string lights still glowing overhead like nothing at all had happened. Eventually, we gathered our coats and walked out into the cool October night, and I stood for a moment in the parking lot looking up at a sky full of more stars than I usually noticed, and I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled, I think, for 39 years without my ever quite realizing it. Nate caught up to me by the car. He didn't say anything at first. He just pulled me into a hug, the kind that says everything words can't quite manage. And when he finally pulled back, he looked at me with those hazel eyes that weren't Gerald's after all, not in any way that counted. "I love you, Dad," he said. "I always have. I always will." "I love you too, son," I told him. "You have been mine since the day you were born, and nothing that happened tonight is ever going to change that." We drove home in a silence that didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt earned. It felt like the particular quiet that settles over a house after a storm has finally passed through and left everything a little cleaner than it found it. That night, lying in bed with Dorothy's hand resting against my chest, I thought about Gerald, about 59 years of friendship, about a jealousy he'd apparently carried in silence since before my own son was even born, about a man who'd finally destroyed himself trying to destroy me. He'd lost his best friend. He'd lost every claim he ever had on being called family. He'd walked out of that lodge with nothing, and he'd done it entirely to himself. And I thought about my son, the way he'd stood there and told a room full of people exactly who his father was, without a moment's hesitation, without a shred of doubt in his voice. A man doesn't earn the word father just by being present at the beginning of something. He earns it every single day after, in every small, unglamorous act of showing up. I had always believed that, somewhere deep down, but I don't think I'd ever had to prove it out loud in front of everyone I loved until that night. 68 years old, and I finally understood what my legacy was actually going to be. It was never the store. It was never the money or the porches or the years of hard work. It was a boy, kneeling beside my chair, calling me Dad. That was everything. That was enough. That was, in the end, the only proof I ever needed.